Most days at the surveillance center started the same way. Coffee in a paper cup, the hum of electronics warming up, and another coordinate set to investigate. I'd been doing this for 3 years now, guiding drones over farms and compounds and abandoned buildings that someone higher up the chain thought looked suspicious. Rural Idaho, eastern Oregon, parts of Montana where cell towers were still a luxury. Places where people went when they didn't want to be found. My workstation occupied the corner of a room that felt more like an upgraded cubicle farm than a military operation. Banks of monitors, ergonomic chairs that squeaked when you leaned back, and fluorescent lights that made everyone look slightly sick. The MQ-9 Reaper I'd been assigned sat somewhere over the Snake River Plain, its cameras pointed down at coordinates that Wesley Gray had handed me 20 minutes earlier. "Standard surveillance package," Wesley had said, dropping the folder on my desk. "Farmhouse outside of Henderson. Intelligence thinks it might be connected to some domestic extremist chatter they picked up last month." Nothing I hadn't heard before. Domestic extremists loved their rural hideouts, and we spent a lot of time watching empty barns and checking license plates on rusted pickup trucks. Most of the time, the biggest discovery was whether someone had remembered to fix their fence posts. I pulled up the targeting system and entered the coordinates. The drone responded with the mechanical precision I'd come to expect, banking left and adjusting its altitude as it moved toward the target area. Through my headset, I could hear the low conversation of other operators working their own assignments. Someone was tracking a convoy near Boise. Another was running pattern analysis on a compound that had been flagged for unusual radio traffic. The farmhouse came into view as I brought the drone around from the southwest. Standard rural Idaho architecture, white clapboard siding that had seen better decades, a steep pitched roof with a few missing shingles, and a wraparound porch that sagged on one corner. A red barn sat about 50 yards away, its paint faded but still recognizable. Between the two buildings, a gravel driveway connected to a dirt road that probably didn't have a name on any map. I zoomed in with the primary camera, scanning for vehicles, people, or anything that might justify the surveillance request. The property looked abandoned, honestly. Weeds had taken over what might have once been a vegetable garden, and the barn doors hung open like someone had left in a hurry and never bothered coming back. No cars, no equipment, no signs of recent habitation. "Control, this is Operator 7, I said into my headset, using the call sign I'd been assigned for this shift. "Initial scan complete on target Henderson 47. Property appears unoccupied, no vehicles or personnel visible." Wesley's voice came back immediately. "Copy that, 7. Run a second pass from the east side. Intelligence wants confirmation on the structure layout." I banked the drone around, bringing it in from a different angle. This was routine too, double-checking from multiple perspectives to make sure we hadn't missed anything important. Sometimes a building that looked empty from one direction turned out to have activity on the back side. Sometimes vehicles were parked under tree cover or inside structures with their doors closed. The farmhouse filled my monitor again as I adjusted the camera angle. Same white siding, same sagging porch, same missing shingles. I made a mental note to include the structural details in my report. The barn looked identical to how it had appeared on the first pass, and I could see tire tracks in the dirt that looked old enough to have been made before the last rainfall. Then something happened that shouldn't have been possible. The farmhouse vanished. Not gradually, not like it was being demolished or covered by smoke. 1 second it was there, clear and detailed on my high-definition monitor, and the next second it had been replaced by what looked like a shadow. Not a shadow cast by something else, but shadow as a thing itself. A perfect black void in the exact shape and size of where the building had been. I blinked hard and looked at the monitor again. The void was still there, darker than anything else in the image. The barn remained visible, The trees around the property looked normal, even the gravel driveway continued exactly where it should have been. But where the farmhouse had stood, there was now a hole in reality that my cameras couldn't penetrate. My first thought was equipment failure. 3 years of operating surveillance drones had taught me that technology breaks in unexpected ways. Camera sensors malfunction, imaging software glitches, satellite feeds get corrupted by atmospheric interference. I reached for the calibration controls and ran a quick diagnostic on the optical systems. Everything came back green. Camera 1, Camera 2, infrared overlay, digital enhancement packages, all functioning normally. I switched between different imaging modes, thinking maybe the problem was isolated to one particular sensor array. The void remained constant across every spectrum I could access. I adjusted the drone's position, moving it in a slow circle around the property. From every angle, the result was identical. The barn, the trees, the road, all perfectly normal. The farmhouse, gone, replaced by something that absorbed light instead of reflecting it. My mouth felt dry. I checked the coordinates on my navigation display, thinking maybe I'd accidentally moved to the wrong location. But the numbers matched exactly what Wesley had given me. This was definitely the right place, and the barn was definitely the same barn I'd seen on the first pass. The farmhouse had simply stopped existing. I tried recalibrating the imaging systems again, running every diagnostic protocol I knew. Focus adjustment, color balance, contrast enhancement. Nothing changed what I was looking at. The void sat there on my monitor like a hole punched through the world, impossibly dark and perfectly defined. This was wrong. This was impossible. In 3 years of drone surveillance, I'd seen equipment failures, weather interference, and operator errors. I'd never seen anything like this. Buildings didn't just disappear and leave behind patches of absolute darkness. Physics didn't work that way. Reality didn't work that way. But there it was, displayed in crisp digital clarity on military-grade surveillance equipment that had cost more than most people's houses. A perfect black void where a farmhouse had been, defying every rational explanation I could think of. "Gray, I need you to see this." My voice came out steadier than I felt. Wesley was 3 stations over, reviewing some paperwork that probably had more immediate importance than whatever anomaly I'd stumbled across. He looked up from his clipboard with that expression I'd learned to read over the past year. Not quite irritation, but close enough. The kind of look that said he was already calculating whether this interruption was worth his time. "What is it, Walker?" "The Henderson property surveillance. Something's wrong with the feed." Gray stood and walked over, his boots making that deliberate sound on the concrete floor that somehow managed to convey authority even in something as simple as crossing a room. I'd noticed that about him early on. Every movement seemed purposeful, measured. Even when he was just getting coffee, it looked like a tactical decision. He leaned over my shoulder to examine the monitor. I caught a whiff of his cologne, something sharp and clean that probably cost more than I spent on groceries in a month. The screen showed exactly what it had been showing for the past 10 minutes. Perfect clarity on 3/4 of the farmhouse property. Then an absolute black rectangle where the main structure should have been. "Looks like a shadow," he said after maybe 15 seconds of study. "That's what I thought initially, but look at the timestamp. It's been consistent for over 10 minutes now. No movement, no variation in density. And check the weather data. Clear skies, no cloud cover that could cause this kind of pattern." Gray straightened up, crossing his arms. I could feel his skepticism radiating off him like heat from an engine. "Equipment malfunctions happen, Walker. Could be a lens obstruction, atmospheric interference, any number of technical issues. When's the last time this particular drone underwent maintenance?" I pulled up the service logs on the secondary monitor, already knowing what they'd show. "Full diagnostic 3 days ago. All systems green across the board. Flight performance has been nominal throughout today's operation. Atmospheric disturbance then. Temperature inversions can create visual anomalies on thermal imaging. You've seen the training materials on environmental interference patterns. The dismissal in his tone made my jaw tighten. But arguing with Gray when he'd already made up his mind was like trying to convince a brick wall to relocate. Sir, I've run diagnostics on both the drone's optical systems and the thermal imaging array. Everything checks out. This isn't equipment failure or atmospheric interference. Look at the edge definition. It's too precise, too geometric. Natural phenomena don't create perfect rectangular shadows. Gray's expression shifted and I recognized the warning signs immediately. The slight tightening around his eyes, the way his shoulders squared just a fraction more. I'd pushed too hard, challenged his assessment too directly. Walker, let me remind you about your recent performance evaluations. 3 incidents in the past 6 months where you've raised concerns about anomalous readings that turned out to be operator error or equipment issues. Your attention to detail is appreciated, but your tendency to see problems where none exist is becoming a pattern. Heat crept up my neck. The 3 incidents he was referring to weren't exactly operator error. They'd been legitimate technical questions that got resolved through proper channels. But Gray had a way of reframing things that made perfectly reasonable concerns sound like paranoid overreactions. Your job right now is to complete this surveillance operation according to mission parameters. Document what you observe, maintain visual contact with the target area, and file a complete report when your shift ends. If you're seeing equipment malfunctions, note them in your technical log and move on. Don't let your imagination turn routine technical difficulties into something they're not. The reprimand stung because it was delivered in that perfectly professional tone that made disagreement seem like insubordination. Gray had mastered the art of making you feel like an idiot while never actually saying you were one. Understood, sir. Good. Carry on. He walked back to his station, dismissing the entire situation with the kind of finality that made further discussion impossible. I watched him settle back into his paperwork, already moving on to whatever administrative task required his attention next. For him, the problem was solved. Technical glitch, case closed, get back to work. I forced myself to follow orders and continue the surveillance operation, adjusting the drone's position to get better coverage of the property's perimeter. The farmhouse might be hidden behind whatever was causing the visual obstruction, but I could still monitor the surrounding area. Maybe I'd catch sight of the Cochran family. The intelligence briefings had identified them as the primary residents, and any surveillance operation worth conducting should at least confirm human presence. The drone's camera swept across the property boundaries, revealing typical rural Montana landscape. Overgrown grass, a few scattered farm buildings in various states of repair, fence lines that had seen better decades. Nothing remarkable, nothing that would justify the level of attention this location was receiving. Then I saw them. 3 figures standing in what used to be the front yard, positioned exactly at the edge where normal visibility met the black void. Johnny Cochran, tall and lean with graying hair. Molly Cochran, shorter and rounder, wearing what looked like a floral print dress. And between them, their 8-year-old daughter Madeline, small and blonde and perfectly still. They weren't moving. They weren't moving at all. Not the natural sway of people standing outside, not the fidgeting of a child getting bored, not even the subtle shift in posture that happens when humans breathe. They stood there like statues facing toward where their house should have been, completely motionless. My first instinct was to check the video feed for technical problems. Maybe the image was frozen, maybe the drone's camera was malfunctioning. But the timestamp in the corner continued updating, and I could see leaves moving on the trees behind the family. The wind was clearly affecting the environment around them, but they remained absolutely still. I watched for 5 minutes, then 10, then 15. The family never moved. Madeline never shifted her weight from one foot to the other. Johnny never turned his head or adjusted his stance. Molly never brushed hair from her face or crossed her arms. They stood there with blank expressions, looking toward the shadow as motionless as mannequins. 20 minutes passed, then 25, then 30. No human being stands that still for 30 consecutive minutes. Children especially don't stand that still. Madeline should have been running around, getting distracted, asking questions, doing any of the 1,000 things 8-year-olds do when they're outside. Instead, she stood between her parents like a small statue, her face empty of any expression I could identify. The sick feeling in my stomach was spreading, turning into something cold and sharp that made it hard to concentrate on the technical aspects of the surveillance. This wasn't an equipment malfunction or atmospheric disturbance. This was something else entirely, something that Gray's dismissive explanations couldn't account for. The Cochran family continued their unnatural vigil at the edge of the shadow, and I knew with absolute certainty that my concerns had been justified, regardless of what my commanding officer believed. I needed a second opinion, and Josephine was the best analyst we had for this kind of technical verification. She worked 2 rows behind me, usually buried in data streams from 3 different monitoring stations. Her setup looked like mission control for a space launch. Multiple monitors arranged in a precise semicircle, cables organized with the kind of obsessive attention that made her invaluable when something went wrong with our equipment. "Josephine, can you take a look at this feed?" She glanced up from her screens, already reaching for her portable diagnostic tablet. Josephine never moved anywhere in the center without that thing. It connected to every system we operated and could run diagnostics that would take me 20 minutes to perform manually. "What kind of problem are we talking about?" "I'm not sure it's a problem. That's what I need you to tell me." She rolled her chair over and I angled my monitor so she could see the display clearly. The Cochran family remained in their exact positions at the shadow's edge. The father with his hands clasped behind his back, the mother standing with her arms crossed, and their teenage daughter positioned slightly ahead of both parents. Josephine connected her tablet to my workstation and pulled up the diagnostic interface. Her fingers moved across the screen with practiced efficiency, checking feed integrity, signal strength, and timestamp data. "How long have you been monitoring this location?" "About 45 minutes. They've been standing like that the entire time." She ran a deeper scan, checking for video loops or any signs of system manipulation. The diagnostics took 3 minutes to complete, long enough for me to watch the family maintain their perfectly still positions while Josephine's equipment verified every aspect of our surveillance system. "Feed is clean," she said finally. "No tampering, no loops, no signal interference. Whatever you're seeing is what's actually happening down there." That confirmation hit me harder than I expected. Part of me had hoped for a technical explanation, something that would make this whole situation normal again. Instead, I had official verification that 3 people had been standing motionless for nearly an hour. Thanks. I needed to be sure. Josephine disconnected her tablet and returned to her station. I moved the drone away from the property, following standard protocol for periodic position changes. The aircraft climbed to 15,000 feet and circled west, giving me a wide view of the surrounding farmland. Other properties showed normal activity: a tractor moving through a distant field, cars traveling the county road, livestock grazing in pastures. I spent 10 minutes monitoring the broader area, hoping the break would reset whatever strange situation I'd encountered. When I guided the drone back to the Cochran property, I expected to find the family had gone inside or moved to different positions. They hadn't moved at all. The father still had his hands clasped behind his back in the exact same position. The mother's arms remained crossed at the identical angle. Their daughter stood precisely where she'd been before, as if someone had paused 3 people mid-motion and forgotten to press play. This wasn't normal human behavior. People shifted weight, adjusted their posture, moved their hands. Even trained soldiers couldn't maintain perfect stillness for over an hour without some minor adjustment. I zoomed the camera closer, trying to determine if they were even breathing. The enhanced magnification revealed more disturbing details. Their clothing showed no movement from wind, not even the slight flutter you'd expect on a normal day. The daughter's hair hung perfectly straight, undisturbed by any breeze. Most unsettling, none of them blinked during the 30 seconds I watched their faces. I needed to check their vital signs, or at least confirm they were alive. Our thermal imaging could detect body heat and basic life functions from this distance. I switched to infrared mode and focused on each family member individually. All 3 showed normal body temperature signatures. Their heat patterns indicated they were alive and breathing, though their respiration appeared unusually shallow and regular. No movement beyond the basic functions necessary for survival. Then something changed. As I watched through the thermal display, all 3 heads turned toward the camera simultaneously. Not toward each other, not toward some sound in their environment, directly toward the drone hovering thousands of feet above them. The movement was perfectly coordinated, as if they'd rehearsed the motion. I switched back to visual mode and zoomed in on their faces. They were looking straight up at the camera with expressions I couldn't quite read. Not fear, not curiosity, something closer to acknowledgement. Then they waved. All 3 raised their right hands in identical gestures, moving with the same eerie synchronization. They held the wave for exactly 5 seconds before lowering their hands back to their original positions. My mouth went dry. There was no way they could see or hear the drone at that altitude. Our aircraft operated in stealth mode specifically to avoid detection during surveillance operations. Even if they'd somehow spotted it, the coordinated response suggested they'd been aware of the monitoring the entire time. Gray. This time I didn't worry about disturbing anyone else in the center. Wesley needed to see this immediately, and I needed someone with more experience to tell me what the hell I'd just witnessed. Wesley approached with the measured pace of someone who'd dealt with panicked subordinates before, but his expression changed when he saw my face. Whatever he read there convinced him this wasn't routine equipment trouble or operator error. What happened? They waved at the camera, all 3 of them at the same time. There's no way they should be able to detect our surveillance from that altitude. Wesley studied the monitor, taking in the family's current positions. They'd returned to their original stances, but something about their posture suggested alertness now, like they were waiting for something to happen. Move aside. He took control of my workstation, his fingers navigating the drone controls with the confidence of someone who'd logged serious flight hours. Wesley adjusted the camera angle and checked our altitude readings before making his decision. I'm taking her down for a closer look. The drone descended steadily, dropping from 15,000 feet to 10,000, then 5,000. Wesley maintained a careful approach pattern, keeping the aircraft outside the property boundaries while reducing our distance to the target. At 3,000 feet, we could see individual details clearly. The texture of their clothing, the precise angles of their limbs, the unnaturally perfect stillness of their hair. Still no movement, Wesley observed. He continued the descent, bringing us to 2,000 feet, then 1,000. The family remained perfectly motionless throughout the approach. But I had the disturbing sense they were tracking our progress somehow. Their faces stayed directed upward, following the drone's path with subtle adjustments that shouldn't have been possible. At 800 feet, Wesley leveled the aircraft and began moving it toward the property's perimeter. We were approaching the edge of the shadow zone, that perfect black void where the farmhouse should have been. The drone's sensors showed normal readings as we crossed over the fence line. But something felt wrong about the way the aircraft responded to controls. "Systems are running sluggish," Wesley muttered. At 600 feet, the first warning indicators appeared on our displays. Navigation systems showed minor fluctuations. Camera feed developed slight interference lines. Nothing critical yet, but enough to suggest we were encountering some kind of electromagnetic disturbance. Wesley continued the approach, determined to get clear visual confirmation of what we were dealing with. The drone reached the shadow's outer edge at 400 feet altitude, close enough to see individual blades of grass in the areas where normal daylight reached the ground. Then everything failed at once. Every system we monitored went dark simultaneously. Video feed, telemetry data, GPS tracking, communication signals. The screens that had been showing the Cochrane property and its impossible shadow turned black. Status indicators that should have displayed aircraft health and position showed nothing but error messages. Wesley worked the controls frantically, trying to re-establish contact with the drone. But our connection was completely severed. According to our instruments, the aircraft had simply ceased to exist. Wesley stood behind my chair, hands braced on the back of it. "Mission abort, bring everything offline." The words hit the room like a dead weight. Josephine's fingers stopped moving across her keyboard. The constant background chatter from the other monitoring stations seemed to pause, though that was probably just my imagination. Travis Washington appeared at my left shoulder within minutes. He always moved fast when equipment failed, clipboard already in hand, pen clicking in that nervous rhythm he'd developed over years of documenting things that went wrong. The guy took his job seriously, maybe too seriously. But right now I was grateful for his thoroughness. "Walk me through the sequence," he said, settling into the empty chair next to mine. His uniform was crisp as always, every crease exactly where it should be. "Start from when you first noticed the anomaly." I kept my voice level and technical. Travis responded better to facts than theories, and I needed this documented properly. He wrote everything down in his careful handwriting, occasionally asking for clarification about timestamps or equipment readings. Thermal imaging showed what exactly? Nothing. Complete absence of heat signature where the structure should have been. And the drone's last telemetry reading? Normal until contact was lost. No indication of mechanical failure or external interference. Travis nodded and made another note. His documentation would be thorough and professional, exactly what the official record required. Equipment failure, pilot error, technical malfunction. Whatever explanation made the most sense on paper. The truth about what I'd actually witnessed would get buried under proper procedure and reasonable doubt. Filing my own incident report took longer than usual. I sat in the small administrative office down the hall from the main surveillance floor, staring at the blank form on my computer screen. How do you describe something that defies description? How do you document the impossible? I kept it factual. Visual anomaly observed at target coordinates. Drone contact lost during reconnaissance. Recommend further investigation. The words felt inadequate, but they were honest. Whatever had happened at that farm, someone higher up the chain needed to know about it. The debriefing session happened the next morning in Conference Room B, the windowless space where we usually reviewed routine surveillance footage. Wesley sat at the head of the small table, looking like he'd gotten about as much sleep as I had. Travis took the chair to his right, incident report neatly organized in a manila folder. Josephine sat across from me, avoiding eye contact. Chloe Hansen walked in precisely at 900 hours, carrying a tablet and wearing that expression she got when she had information nobody wanted to hear. Defense intelligence analysts had a talent for delivering bad news in the most professional way possible. and Chloe was better at it than most. "I've reviewed the satellite imagery for the Henderson farm coordinates," she said, settling into the remaining chair. Her voice carried that slight, formal tone she used during official briefings. "The most recent pass was completed yesterday at 14:30 hours. She turned her tablet toward the center of the table. The screen showed a clear aerial view of a farmhouse, barn, and surrounding fields. Everything looked normal, peaceful even. Green grass, weathered wood siding, a gravel driveway that curved up from the main road. No anomalies detected, no structural damage, no evidence of the shadow phenomenon described in the incident report. The words hung in the air like an accusation. I found myself leaning forward, studying the image more closely. The farmhouse was exactly where it should have been, looking exactly like it should have looked. White paint peeling slightly around the windows, a small front porch with 2 chairs, even a dog lying in the shade near the barn. "What about thermal imaging?" I asked. "Standard readings throughout. The structure shows expected heat signatures for a residential building during daytime hours." Wesley cleared his throat. "Any indication of equipment malfunction on our end?" "The satellite systems function normally during the pass. All instruments reported standard operational parameters." I wanted to argue, to insist that what I'd seen was real. But the evidence was right there on Chloe's tablet, contradicting everything I remembered. A normal farm with normal buildings and normal heat signatures, exactly what should have been there all along. "The drone loss remains unexplained," Travis added, consulting his notes. "No mechanical failure indicators, no environmental factors that would account for complete signal loss." "These things happen," Wesley said. His tone suggested the matter was closed. "Equipment fails. Signals get disrupted. We'll requisition a replacement and move on to the next assignment." The meeting ended with handshakes and the usual promises to follow up if any new information surfaced. But I could see it in their faces, the polite skepticism, the careful distance they were already putting between themselves and my account of events. Whatever had happened at the Henderson farm, I was the only one who remembered it the way it actually occurred. 2 days later, I climbed the stairs to my apartment with a grocery bag in one hand and my keys in the other, thinking about nothing more complicated than whether I had enough beer in the fridge for the weekend. The narrow hallway on the second floor smelled like the cleaning solution our landlord used, mixed with cooking odors from the other units. Normal evening sounds drifted through the thin walls. Television programs, someone washing dishes, a phone conversation in the apartment next to mine. The package was sitting against my door, unmarked and roughly the size of a paperback book. Brown cardboard, no shipping label, no return address, just my apartment number written in black marker across the top. Blake Wagner's door opened before I could pick it up. The old man appeared in his doorway wearing a cardigan over a button-up shirt, bifocals perched on his nose. He'd lived in the building longer than anyone, and he kept track of the comings and goings in that gentle way elderly neighbors do. "Evening, Justin. Saw someone drop that off for you earlier." "Any idea who it was?" Blake paused, his forehead creasing with concentration. "Can't say I got a good look at them. Delivery person of some kind, I think. They were gone by the time I made it to the window." "What time was this?" "Oh, sometime after lunch, maybe 2 o'clock. He shook his head apologetically. "Sorry, I can't be more helpful. My memory isn't what it used to be." I thanked him and picked up the package. It was lighter than expected, with something small and hard shifting around inside when I moved it. Blake watched me fumble with my keys, clearly curious about the unmarked delivery but too polite to ask directly. Inside my apartment, I set the package on the kitchen counter and stared at it for a long moment. No return address meant no way to trace the sender. No delivery company logo meant whoever brought it wasn't using official channels. The smart thing would be to call building security or maybe contact the postal service about suspicious packages. Instead, I tore open the cardboard. A small plastic case fell onto the counter, the kind used for storing memory cards or USB drives. Inside was a single micro SD card, black plastic with no identifying marks or labels. Just a tiny piece of technology that could hold gigabytes of data, sitting in my kitchen like it belonged there. I turned it over in my fingers, looking for any indication of where it had come from or what it might contain. Nothing. The card was completely anonymous, which somehow made it more unsettling than if it had been covered in warning labels. My laptop was sitting on the small table I used as a desk, closed and charging from the night before. Standard personal computer, nothing special. Certainly nothing connected to military networks or classified systems. Whatever was on this card, I could view it without violating any direct security protocols. But I knew better. Unknown storage devices from unknown sources were exactly the kind of security risk we were trained to avoid. The smart move was to turn it in, let the proper authorities examine it in a controlled environment. Let someone else take responsibility for whatever information it contained. I found myself walking toward the laptop anyway, the memory card warm in my palm. Curiosity was stronger than caution. And after everything that had happened at the Henderson farm, I needed answers more than I needed to follow proper procedure. The tiny piece of plastic felt heavier than it should have, like it was pulling me forward. The laptop opened with a soft click. The screen came to life, showing my desktop wallpaper and the usual collection of icons. I located the memory card slot on the side of the machine and held the card up to it, hesitating for just a moment before sliding it into place. The computer recognized the device immediately, displaying a small notification window, asking what I wanted to do with the removable storage. My finger hovered over the trackpad, knowing that once I opened whatever was on this card, there would be no going back. I clicked Open Folder to view files. The video file opened with a soft chime from my speakers. At first, everything looked completely normal, just a family dinner scene that could have been pulled from any home movie collection. The image quality was crisp, too crisp for standard surveillance footage, with that slightly oversaturated color that made everything look more vivid than real life. Johnny Cochran stood at the head of what appeared to be a dining room table, carving into a roast with methodical precision. Each slice fell away in perfectly uniform thickness, his movements controlled and deliberate in a way that reminded me of someone following a recipe they'd memorized. Molly moved around the table's perimeter, adjusting place settings and straightening napkins that already looked perfectly arranged. Her motions had that same mechanical quality I'd noticed through the drone footage, functional but somehow disconnected. Madeline sat in a chair that looked too big for her small frame, poking at something on her plate with a fork. She wasn't eating, just moving the food around in small circles, her face blank and unfocused. The whole scene had the staged quality of a department store display, like someone had arranged a family dinner without understanding what made it feel alive. The camera perspective slowly began to shift, panning left with the smooth motion of professional equipment. My coffee had gone cold in my hands, but I couldn't bring myself to look away from the screen. Something about the movement felt wrong, like the camera operator was revealing information they shouldn't have access to. The dining room walls came into view, then a kitchen counter, then my stomach dropped so fast I thought I might actually throw up. The window in the background wasn't showing the endless Idaho farmland I'd expected. Instead, I was looking at my own backyard. The small shed where I stored my bike, the patchy grass that never quite grew right near the fence line, the clothesline that the previous tenant had left behind. Every detail was exactly as it should be, down to the lawnmower tracks that Michael had left 2 days ago when he'd cut the grass. But the Cochran family wasn't in their farmhouse. They were in my backyard, arranged around a table that definitely hadn't been there when I'd left for work this morning. The roast Johnny was carving, The place settings Molly was adjusting, Madeline's untouched plate, all of it was happening maybe 30 feet from where I sat at my computer. My hands started shaking badly enough that I had to set down my coffee cup. This couldn't be real. There was no logical way for this to be happening. The storage device must have contained some kind of altered footage. Or maybe the video file was corrupted in a way that overlaid different images. But even as I tried to rationalize what I was seeing, every detail looked absolutely authentic. The camera continued its smooth pan, and now I could see my kitchen window in the frame. The same kitchen window I'd stood at this morning while making toast, looking out at an empty yard. The angle was perfect, like someone had positioned the camera specifically to capture both the dinner scene and my house in a single shot. Then all three members of the Cochran family stopped what they were doing and turned toward the camera. Their movements were perfectly synchronized, like dancers following choreography they'd practiced for years. Johnny set down his carving knife with deliberate care. Molly straightened from adjusting a napkin. Madeline placed her fork beside her plate and folded her hands in her lap. Their faces wore the same vacant expressions I'd seen through the drone surveillance. Blank, empty, waiting. But now they were looking directly at me through my computer screen, and I could see my kitchen window reflected in their unnaturally still eyes. They stood there for what felt like hours, but was probably only seconds. Three figures arranged in my backyard like sentries. Panic hit me with enough force to knock the air out of my lungs. I shoved back from my desk so hard that my chair nearly tipped over, then stumbled toward my kitchen window with the desperate hope that what I'd seen on the video was some kind of technical error or deliberate fake. The backyard was empty. Completely, utterly empty, just like it had been every day since I'd moved in 6 months ago. The grass was the same patchy green it had always been, with the same bare spots near the fence where the soil was too hard for anything to grow properly. Michael was working near the property line about 50 yards away, trimming the hedge that separated my unit from the one next door. He looked up when he noticed me at the window and gave a brief nod of acknowledgement before returning to his work. Everything was exactly as it should be. No dining table, no family, no evidence that anyone had been in my yard at all. I pressed my face against the glass, searching for any sign that the scene from the video had actually happened, but there was nothing. Just ordinary afternoon sunlight falling across ordinary grass with the ordinary sound of Michael's hedge trimmer providing background noise. Relief flooded through me so fast I felt dizzy. Whatever was on that storage device, it wasn't real surveillance footage. Someone had created an elaborate fake, probably using green screen technology or digital compositing to make it look like the Cochran family was in my backyard. The whole thing was obviously designed to mess with my head, and I'd fallen for it completely. But when I returned to my computer, the video was still playing. The Cochran family had moved. They were no longer arranged around their dinner table, and they were no longer looking toward the camera with those empty, waiting expressions. Instead, all three of them were walking across my backyard with slow, deliberate steps heading directly toward my back door. Johnny led the way with his hands at his sides and his face completely expressionless. Molly followed 2 steps behind and slightly to his left, her movements matching his pace exactly. Madeline brought up the rear, her small legs working to maintain the same measured rhythm as her parents. They moved like people walking through water, each step careful and controlled. There was no urgency in their approach, no indication that they were aware of being filmed. They simply walked toward my house as if they had every right to be there, as if this was something they did every day at exactly this time. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely work the mouse, but I managed to pause the video just as the family reached the bottom step of my back porch. The image froze with all 3 figures arranged in perfect formation, their faces turned slightly upward toward the door they were about to reach. I ran back to the kitchen window, pressing my face against the glass hard enough to leave marks. The backyard was still empty. Michael was still trimming his hedge, completely oblivious to anything unusual. But on my computer screen, the Cochran family stood on my back porch waiting. Walking into Wesley's office felt like carrying a live grenade. The memory card sat in my palm, barely larger than my thumbnail, but it might as well have weighed 50 pounds. My commanding officer looked up from his paperwork with that expression he got when someone was about to complicate his day. "What's the situation, Walker?" I placed the card on his desk and stepped back. "Sir, I need to report an incident involving the Henderson surveillance footage. This contains video evidence that requires immediate review by intelligence personnel." Wesley picked up the card, turning it over in his fingers. "Evidence of what, exactly?" "The Cochran family, sir. They appeared on surveillance footage taken at my residence last night." The words sounded insane coming out of my mouth, but I kept my voice level. "The timestamp shows them on my back porch at 23:47 hours. His eyebrows went up. "Your back porch?" "Yes, sir. The same family that disappeared into that black zone during our mission yesterday." "Correct." Wesley leaned back in his chair, studying my face for signs that I'd completely lost it. I couldn't blame him. If someone had walked into my office with this story, I'd have been reaching for the psychological evaluation forms. "Walk me through what you found." I gave him the facts, the memory card in my computer bag, the video file, the impossible footage of 3 people who shouldn't exist standing on my property. I left out the part where I'd watched them through my window because that would have definitely triggered the psych eval. Wesley listened without interruption, his expression growing more serious with each detail. When I finished, he was quiet for nearly a minute, just tapping the memory card against his desk. "You're certain about the timestamp?" "Verified multiple times, sir." "And you have no explanation for how this footage was created or how it ended up in your possession?" "None whatsoever." He stood up and walked to his secure terminal. "I'm forwarding this to military intelligence immediately. They'll want to interview you within the hour." His fingers moved across the keyboard with practiced efficiency. "Until then, you're relieved of active surveillance duties." "Sir, This isn't a disciplinary action, Walker. But until we understand what we're dealing with, I need you away from sensitive operations." He turned back to face me. "Go home. Someone from intelligence will contact you soon." The interview happened in a windowless conference room that smelled like burnt coffee and industrial carpet. 2 men in dark suits who introduced themselves as Agent Martinez and Agent Hoffman. They had that particular federal look, bland faces, expensive watches, and the kind of calm that came from hearing impossible stories every day. They asked the same questions Wesley had asked, then asked them again in different ways. They wanted to know about my background, my mental health history, whether I'd been under unusual stress lately. Standard procedure for when someone reported something that shouldn't be possible. Agent Martinez took notes on a tablet while Agent Hoffman watched my facial expressions. After an hour, they seemed satisfied that I wasn't lying or having a psychotic break. "We'll be conducting a full investigation of your property," Martinez said. "A security specialist will be assigned to monitor your residence until we can determine the nature of this incident." "Monitor how?" "Discreet surveillance. You won't notice her presence unless there's an immediate threat." Agent Hoffman slid a business card across the table. "Specialist Bell will be your primary contact. Any unusual activity, you call that number immediately." I met Tara Bell the next morning when she knocked on my apartment door at 0800 sharp. She was tall, athletic, with the kind of alert eyes that missed nothing. Her handshake was firm and brief. "I'll be maintaining a watch on this building and the surrounding area," she said, getting straight to business. Surveillance equipment is already in place. I need to walk through your apartment to identify potential security concerns. She moved through my space like a professional, checking sight lines, noting entry points, examining the back porch where the impossible footage had been recorded. Her scanner beeped occasionally as she tested for electronic devices or transmissions. "Ooh, clean," she announced after 20 minutes. No foreign surveillance equipment, no signs of forced entry or tampering. What about outside? We've swept the entire property. No physical evidence that anyone was present on your back porch last night. She closed her scanner and looked at me directly. "Mr. Walker, I want you to understand that we take these reports seriously, but our investigation has found no credible threat to your safety." Over the following week, military intelligence turned my life upside down. They interviewed my neighbors, my landlord, everyone I worked with. They brought in dogs to search for trace evidence. They installed motion sensors and infrared cameras around the building perimeter. They found nothing. Blake Wagner, my neighbor across the hall, told them he'd been home all evening and hadn't seen anyone unusual. Michael Lee, my landlord, confirmed that his hedge trimming had been completely normal. No interruptions or strange visitors. The official report, when it came back, was exactly what I'd expected. No evidence of trespassing, no signs of surveillance or stalking. The video footage was classified as origin unknown and filed away somewhere I'd never see it again. Agent Martinez called to deliver the conclusions personally. "Our assessment is that no actual threat exists," he said. "The security monitoring will continue for another week. Then we'll scale back to periodic check-ins. And the footage? Still under analysis. But Mr. Walker, I want you to understand, whatever you believe you saw, our investigation shows no evidence that anyone was actually present on your property." I thanked him for the thoroughness and hung up. Outside my window, Michael was watering his flower bed with the same yellow hose he'd been using all week. Normal Tuesday afternoon in a normal neighborhood. But normal had stopped existing for me the moment I'd opened that video file. The first time I heard the tapping, I convinced myself it was tree branches hitting the window. We'd had some wind that night, and the old maple outside my bedroom had always been close to the building. I rolled over and tried to go back to sleep. 3 soft taps, pause, 3 more taps, too regular for wind, too deliberate for accident. I got up and looked outside, pressing my face against the glass. The backyard was empty, just shadows from the streetlight filtering through the maple's leaves. No movement, no sign that anyone had been there. The tapping stopped. I went back to bed and lay awake until dawn, listening for any sound that didn't belong. Birds started singing around 5:30, and eventually I drifted off to sleep. The second time, 3 nights later, I was ready. I'd moved a chair next to the bedroom window and kept a flashlight on my nightstand. When the tapping started, 3 soft knocks, pause, 3 more, I grabbed the flashlight and pulled the curtain aside in one quick motion. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating my small backyard in harsh white light. Empty grass. The fence Michael had installed last year. The garbage cans lined up neatly against the building. Nothing. I kept the flashlight trained on the yard for 5 minutes, scanning every shadow, every possible hiding spot. The tapping had stopped the instant I'd turned on the light, but I could feel something watching me from beyond the flashlight's reach. When I finally went back to bed, my hands were shaking. By the 4th incident, I'd stopped bothering with the flashlight. The tapping came almost every night now, always during the darkest hours between midnight and dawn. Always the same pattern, 3 knocks, pause, 3 more. Always stopping the moment I moved toward the window. Tarabelle's surveillance equipment never registered anything unusual. Her motion sensors stayed silent. Her infrared cameras showed nothing but empty yard and normal nighttime temperature variations. But I knew something was out there. The first time I saw them clearly was a Thursday night in late September. I'd gotten used to the tapping by then, had even started sleeping through it on some nights. But this time was different. This time, when I looked out the window, 3 silhouettes stood at the very edge of my property. They were motionless, perfectly still in the way that human beings never managed to be. Not breathing, not shifting weight from foot to foot, not making the tiny unconscious movements that living people couldn't avoid. A man, a woman, and a child. The same proportions I'd seen in that impossible video footage. They stood just beyond the reach of the streetlight, where the shadows from the neighboring building created a dark strip along my fence line. Waiting. Watching my window with the patience of things that had nowhere else to be. I stared at them for nearly an hour. They never moved, never acknowledged that I was watching them back. They just stood there, 3 dark shapes against the darker night, until I finally couldn't keep my eyes open any longer. When I woke up at dawn, they were gone. I called Tara Bell's emergency number and reported what I'd seen. She arrived within 20 minutes, bringing additional scanning equipment and a partner whose name I never caught. They spent the entire morning going over my backyard with metal detectors, soil displacement sensors, and some kind of electromagnetic field reader. They took photographs of the fence line, measured the distance from my window to where I'd seen the figures, and collected samples of grass and dirt. No evidence of human presence, Tara told me when they finished. No footprints, no disturbed vegetation, no residual heat signatures. Whatever you thought you saw, Mr. Walker, no one was actually there. But I knew what I'd seen, and more importantly, I knew they'd be back. The visits became regular after that. Not every night, but often enough that I started expecting them. 3 silhouettes at the edge of my property, standing in that unnatural stillness, waiting for me to acknowledge what I'd witnessed in that dark farmhouse where a family had disappeared into nothing. No one else could see them. Tara's equipment registered nothing. The neighbors noticed nothing unusual. Even when I pointed them out to Blake Wagner during one of our hallway conversations, he looked right through them and asked if I was feeling all right. But they were there. Every few nights when the darkness was deepest and the rest of the world was asleep, the Cochran family stood at the edge of my yard and reminded me that some things couldn't be explained away by official reports or rational analysis. Whatever I'd witnessed during that surveillance mission, whatever had consumed that farmhouse and everything in it, had followed me home. And no amount of military intelligence or security monitoring was going to change that fundamental truth.